there, everybody. This is Anne. Welcome back to Painting Big for the final Fundamentals of Miniature Painting video. Yes, we're going to talk about wet into wet blending, often just called wet blending, today. All right, let's get into it. All right, right here back with our priest, our paladin, whatever you want to call him, and we're going to talk about wet blending. All right, so there are two different kinds of wet blending, two different ways to tackle this. One uses a single brush, where you're putting down the color, the first color, and then you're loading up the brush with the second color and you're blending the two together. There's also a one brush technique called two color brush, where you would dip the brush in your first color and then just dip the tip in the second color and paint, say, a stripe down the side, and it would blend the two together. So that's another type of wet and wet blending, but they're still both one brush. There's also what we call two brush blending. This is a technique popularized by Privateer Press. They do War Machine and Hordes. You guys may have heard of them. And they popularized a form of wet blending that essentially you laid down your colors, but you kept a second brush in your mouth that you could use to then blend those colors together once you had them both down on the model. So all of these are valid techniques. It's all the same way to get to the same point. The most important thing to take away is you are working with both colors while they are wet. So you're not waiting for one to dry, you're just jumping right in. So this can be fraught, right? Because, you know, what happens if your first color starts to dry and you add in your second color and then you get lots of globby paint and, you know, stuff that peels up and yada yada. Yes, exactly. So you've got to be fast to do this. And fast is good because the purpose of this technique is to set up a quick foundational blend that then, if you want to, you can refine using techniques like glazing and layering, right? But the basis of it gets set up very, very fast. And some people take to this super quickly. Actually, kids can do it really well. So I taught a 11-year-old one summer at my local game store. And layering, not so much, but when I showed him wet blending, he went right into it and he got it right away. And he ended up getting a Youngblood's Golden Demon later that year. So I'm proud. Yes, I'm proud. If you're out there, kid, you know who you are. I'm still proud. Great job. I hope you've gone far. Don't lose the hobby. All right. With that digression, I did want to also mention that climate can influence this technique. Obviously, if you live in a very hot and arid climate like Arizona, or you live in the high desert, very low humidity like Santa Fe, you could run into problems with this because your paint's going to dry so fast on the model, right? But just so you know, if you live in New Orleans, then you might have a great time with this technique, or somewhere that's more humid. But if you live in a very arid climate, you may experience issues. You may have to switch things up a little bit. All right? So let's talk about our model here. I've obviously put down a base coat here. Do you need to put down a base coat when wet blending? No, you don't. You have a choice. You can use your paint full strength or close to it so that it's very high coverage. And in that case, your wet blend establishes your shadow, midtone, and highlight all in one go right over your primer. And that's totally doable. Or you can do what I'm doing here. You can have a base coat down and work over the top of it. And the reason you would make one choice over the other than your climate, maybe, would be that maybe the paint you're working with is a little more transparent. Or maybe you want to work with it a little thinner because you like the thinner paint, you like the way that it blends. In that case, if you're going to work with your paint thinner or you're going to use a transparent color, then yeah, you're going to want to lay down a base coat first. It just means you don't have to worry about whether your paint is covering or not while you're trying to do this technique. It gives you one less thing to worry about. So what about brush? You want kind of a medium brush for the surface, and you want a softer brush, like a sable. If you try to use a Taklon for this, you're going to notice brush strokes easier than if you use a soft brush. That said, if you use too soft of a brush, like one of those big floofy makeup brushes, you may lack precision. You may get a great blend, but you may lack precision with it. And speaking of precision, this is a technique that tends to work best over larger surfaces, like big folds. I also use it on musculature. Here, let me show you a couple of examples. So this is one example, and this ogre, I did his muscle tones all with wet blending. So, and then a final layering highlight. But you can see how these big masses, it'd be very easy to just do a big blend instead of having to worry about trying to layer everything. So I used wet blending to set up the shadow and midtone for these before I went in for a final highlight. Two more examples. We have Wolfie, who I painted a very long time ago. This is a Confrontation Wolfen from Rackham. They haven't been around for a while. You can still get them online if you do some eBay searches. This is Varger. He's a great model. But with his fur tones, for these big muscle masses, I set these up with wet blending. So that's another example. And finally, we have Rock Troll. He's really cool, and his muscle masses were all set up with wet blending. And then I went in with the final highlight to make these lighter areas pop out. But otherwise, it's all wet blending all the time here. You may have noticed I like to do this on non-human skin tones. You can do it for human skin tones if you have a big model, like a 75 millimeter or 54 millimeter. It totally works that way. You can also use it to set up fur. I have at least one video on my Patreon, patreon.com/paintingbig, where I talk about using wet blending to set up fur. It works great over textured surfaces if you need to get a quick blend. Okay, so let's not run down too many bunny holes with this. I totally am inclined to run down bunny holes with this. I am. I love wet blending. I use it all the time. But let's actually stick to the topic here and talk about why would you use thick paint over thin paint or vice versa. When you use thinner paint, then your paint kind of flows together, right? Like if you look at paint in the palette and you drag a brush through it, see how this is just like, after I drag the brush through, it's closing right up, right? So essentially what that's doing is if I had a pool of this paint, which I will in a bit, on this model, and then I added another paint, into it, it would all tend to flow together. So it would tend to minimize brush strokes. So that's something to think about. Now, that does lead us to the subject of additives. Additives are things you add to your paint to make certain effects or get certain qualities. The one that applies in this situation that we're always asked about is slow dry or drying retarder. So essentially this is going to be a substance that you add into your paint that essentially keeps water in it for longer. It keeps it from drying out. Now, you want to use a very small amount of this because if you add too much, your paint will dry maybe with a glossy-ish kind of look, and you're going to find that it does not wear very well. It will easily scratch off, pull off, peel off. You can really affect what I would call the adhesion, how well the paint sticks to the model if you add too much of this stuff. So whenever dealing with drying retarder, experiment a bit, or when in doubt, put just a little bit in your brush and mix that into your paint. And then do it again if you find that you need more. But figuring out how much works for your climate and where you are is definitely worth it. Do you need it? If you're in a really humid climate, you probably don't even need it. But if you do, just keep in mind, be really gentle with it. Just work just a little bit. A little bit goes a long way. All right, so let's actually talk about technique. Oh my gosh, so much to talk about. You can see how this is a complex topic, right? And yet it's so simple. I used to call it smooshing. Smooshing was my name for it because it really is simple and easy. I usually start out by putting, as I mentioned, a fairly thick coat onto the fold that I'm going to blend. And I would only blend one of these folds at a time. If I was doing this for muscle areas, I'd do like the shoulder first, and then the bicep, and then the tricep, and then the forearm. I'd break it down because your paint's going to dry, right? It's going to start to dry pretty quick. You can get the most mileage out of this by just working on one area at a time. All right, so let us go for it. I'm at about a 5-to-1 paint to water on both of these. It's going to make it a little thicker. It's going to be more likely to show brush strokes. I'm working with a slightly larger brush so that I can cover the area and hopefully not leave too many brush strokes. And I'm going to put down a thick layer. This is a lot of paint. Put down a thick layer to begin with, and then I'm going to blend in. So thick layer. The thicker your thick paint is, the longer it takes to dry. Then I'm going to grab a little bit of this and just start working it in. And I'm going to start actually using the brush stroke I tell you never to use. But then I'm going to rinse out my brush. I'm going to grab more of my beginning green, and I'm going to start feathering it in from the side. And I'm going to see if I can get this to blend nicely. And I'm going to get it from the other side. This is where you might need to reapply some paint if you see that your paint is starting to dry. And if I leave this center section alone and I don't try to blend it more, I'm going to not pull as much green into it, and it's going to stay lighter. Now I can continue with my Wilderness Green. I can bring it into the edges of this even while it's still a little bit wet and get a decent blend with it. This side is starting to dry. I didn't get to it quite in time. Might be able to get it though. maybe. If I just pull a little bit of it out and keep it wet, and then grab a little bit more of my wilderness green. There. All right, so you can see the blend there. It's not a bad blend. So it was fast. And you can see there is a certain amount of finesse involved, right? You've got to kind of go back and forth. You've got to feel confident of that. So practice is going to make perfect with this technique. Can you do two of these? Like, I obviously lost my lemon yellow. Could I take like a half, this color, like this halfway mix, and my lemon yellow and start here and do another blend? Yes, but it'd be hard because you're working on a very small area at that point. It's hard to be precise and get a blend in there without having to spread it out and maybe overwhelming what you did before. This is where I say I would usually use layering. Or if I saw this kind of thing, I might choose it if I thought this might be my result and I wanted definitely to get my midtone all the way to my highlight. I would probably start with a green that's halfway between these two. I might have started with a lighter green, like maybe cat's eye green, and my lemon yellow. Done that, and then I would be done. Then I would be able to layer this darker green in. And the reason I would do that instead of going up is that it's usually easier to layer in dark colors in shadows because many of the darker colors that we deal with in miniature painting are a little bit translucent. They're more translucent, at least, than colors that have white in them. So when in doubt, go your mid to your high and then layer in your shadow. But yeah, I mean, this is where I would grab this yellow and maybe make a little bit of a layer with it. 1 second. It's colored water, I know, but that's layering when you've got a white when you've got white in the paint. I'm going to switch to a thinner brush. And I'd start to bring up that lemon yellow along the bottom and a little bit down the middle of this. And I would pretty much just layer that up. Maybe I thinned it a little too much, but I did not want to get brush strokes. There we go. Now we can see it. You see how easily you get brush strokes though. That's why I started with the colored water approach. And if I want to, I can wet blend a little bit of this layer. Like if I get too much brush stroke and I want to take a little bit of my green and blend that in, I can, actually. I can do that. That's what I call a spot wet blend, where I've got a very small surface, but I'm usually starting with layering at that point. I'm not actually starting with a wet blend that I'm further refining. There. So then we brought up that lower part with a higher highlight there. And once you've got, as you guys may know, like if you've tried blending and you failed, you know that even getting that first nice blend is really kind of the hard part a lot of the time. Once you've got that, then you can go up or down from there. So this just lets you get that a little easier, right? And you can see that it is smoother looking than this right out the gate. Okay, so one last thing to say is that when you are choosing colors for this, test them. So before I chose these two colors, I mixed them together to see if I liked the color I got. Because the thing that can happen to you is that, and that's the color that they're going to make together, right? What can happen when you're dealing with, say you choose a light color, it's got a lot of white in it, is you can lose a lot of the brightness, the intensity, the saturation of your dark or your mid. So if you really, really wanted it to stay a bright green, like my bright green ended up here, you might notice that it loses a bit of that if you're using a color at your top end that has a lot of white in it. So that's why you always want to do a mix up front, kind of be ready for that. Otherwise you could get disappointed pretty quick. So pre-mix your colors, make sure that you like what they're going to make when you start smooshing them together on the model. I would love to go in and introduce like layer in shadows and show you guys like more, but I think you get the idea of what wet blending is, and you can use all sorts of different brush strokes, and you can like go back and forth, and you can mix in some layering and then some glazing. It is a really versatile, fast technique. If you just can't get it, don't beat yourself up. What I tell people about this technique is It is really useful to have in your toolbox, but it's not necessary. There are brilliant painters across the world who never wet blend. So don't consider it a must-have. But if it works for you, if you can make it work, it is a really, really useful tool, especially for speed in your toolbox. And it lends itself naturally to using a wet palette, because obviously you can just mix the colors and apply, mix the colors and apply, you know, go back and forth. Really easy, right? It's very intuitive, an intuitive match for a wet palette. I've gone way over time with this. I knew I would, because it's such a crazy, versatile technique, and I use it for so many things. If you have any questions, I have a Patreon, patreon.com/paintingbig. I have a Discord attached to my Patreon, and I do answer questions in there at least once or twice a week. So if you want to sign up, I think I do have a free level still at this point. And if not, I have a $2 level. And at the $2 level, you also get the PDF that goes along with this video. So if you are more like me, I tend to learn by reading, then I'll watch the video, and I get more out of it that way. So for my $2 tier, just for these last few months, I've been doing $2 companion PDFs to these fundamentals videos. All right, I'm gonna stop. If anybody stuck through to this point, whoa, kudos to you. This is way too long for a YouTube video. All right, thanks everybody. Thanks for sticking with me. We're gonna keep doing this, but we're going to go into more like expanding on fundamentals next. Doing more specific things like eyeballs and how to paint buckles and, you know, and different textures and shaded metallics and things like that. We're going to be very, very specific. I'm going to try to keep them very short videos, but hopefully we can cover all the different things you might find on your miniatures with little short bites of knowledge. All right. So look forward to that for the future, and I'll see you guys next time. This is Anne signing off.